Welcome to choosing the right option for building your Helix solutions. Today, we're going to compare and contrast several options for building your Helix solutions in Visual Studio. We're going to cover doing it from scratch, or using tools such as Yeoman and the Sitecore Helix Templates Visual Studio extension. My name is Shelley Benhoff, and I'm a Sitecore Technology MVP, lead developer at TVG, and Pluralsight author. In case you're new to this topic, I just wanted to cover what Helix is. Helix is a set of overall design principles and conventions for Sitecore development. Learning Helix from the start will help you create much more stable Sitecore implementations by adhering to Sitecore recommended practices. Let's begin by talking about the anatomy of a Helix solution. Helix solutions can be very complex depending on the Sitecore implementation and version that you're working with and how many features it has. There are three main layers in a Helix solution: feature, foundation, and project. The feature layer is where the components and pieces of functionality for your Sitecore implementation are stored. This would include anything from view renderings to controller renderings and integrations. The foundation layer will house projects that are at the core of your Sitecore implementation. Some examples would include configuration and third-party frameworks such as Bootstrap, Foundation, or jQuery, just to name a few. And the project layer is for presentation, including layouts and page types. This layer brings together everything from the other layers to combine features with presentation to produce the final website. Sitecore Helix architecture enables developers to write code in a modular way so that any change made to one piece of code only affects the project where that code is stored. If you think about it this way, in the olden days, we used to have one project for the whole website. Any change that you made would affect your project's one and only DLL. Now with Sitecore Helix architecture, you have multiple projects per Visual Studio solution. So then that way, when you make a change to one particular feature, it only impacts the DLL for that particular project. And this makes it very easy to have a predictable structure to make maintenance much easier later on. One of the keys to understanding Helix is to understand how it works to manage dependencies. Think of it as top-down or bottom-up. Helix modules in the project layer can inherit from any project in any other layer. Modules in the feature layer can only inherit from projects or modules in the foundation layer. And projects in the foundation layer can only inherit from other projects in that same layer. Understanding how Helix works to manage dependencies will help you to figure out which layer your Helix modules would fit into. And how you set up your solutions is, of course, up to you, but there are many methods. And first, we're going to talk about building Helix solutions from scratch. This is something that people still do, and I believe that every Sitecore developer needs to understand this in order to understand how to use the tools that we'll talk about later that help to automate a lot of these very repetitive steps. First, of course, you would need to create your Visual Studio solution and then manually add the project, feature, and foundation folders. You would also need to know what version of .NET is compatible with the Sitecore version you're working with. Then in the file system, you would need to create the SRC or source folder in your project root. And then inside of the source folder, you would need to then also create the same project, feature, and foundation folders again. These are the folders where the code for your project will be stored. And next, you need to add Helix modules or projects to your Visual Studio solution. And you would need to know the naming convention prefix .layer .module. And then, of course, you would also need to know the version of .NET that you're using in your solution so that the version in your projects match the version in the solution. And you would also need to manually add references for MVC, Sitecore, Microsoft web development, anything that you would need. And then when you add your projects in Visual Studio, you will be prompted for the save location. So this is where you would need to manually create your folders in your source folder following the same naming convention, prefix, layer, module. You also need to create the code and serialization folders to follow Helix guidelines. That was a lot of steps. For the most part, you would have to redo all of those steps manually for every other project or module that you create in your solution. But at this point, you could start building out your renderings and overall presentation layer. You would still need to add Helix modules for every feature in your implementation as well. Redo all of the manual steps there again. This can be very time consuming depending on the number of projects in your solution. But for smaller solutions, this is actually a viable option that I know a lot of people still use. Luckily, there are a number of tools that can help you automate a lot of the repetitive steps involved in building Helix solutions. First, let's talk about Yeoman. There we go. And then you can run the command npm install -g yo to install Yeoman. And this will take a couple minutes. And when that is finished, then you can run the command npm install generator helix -g to install the Helix generator. And then to create a Helix solution, you just run the command yo helix in your empty project root folder. And it might ask you if you want to allow Yeoman to collect usage statistics. And I'm all about privacy, so I'm going to say no. Then it will ask you to select your solution type. I will choose empty for the purposes of this demo. And then you can enter a name for your Helix solution or select the default. I'm actually going to name this Helix Generator Demo, all one word. And I will go with the default source folder. This is where your projects will be stored in the file system. And then it'll ask you to choose the version of .NET that you want to use. I'll choose the latest 4.8, which is compatible with Sitecore 10. And you can enter the local website URL, and I will go with the default here as well. So as you can see, your solution has been created. And if you go back and look at your project folder in the file system, you should see all of the files there. So projects, Helix generator demo, you see that the source folder is added. And then if you click on that, you will see that the Helix folders have been added in there for each layer. So then to add a new project to your solution, you can run the command Helix add, and then you can add the project name and an optional vendor prefix. The vendor prefix is useful to organize your projects for the vendors or clients that you're working with. I'm going to call this module page content. And then it'll ask you to name your project here as well. And I'll select the default page content, which I also entered above. And I will include Unicorn for serialization, and I will accept the default source folder. I'm going to skip the optional vendor prefix here as well. And then you would choose your Helix layer. This particular project will go into the feature layer because it will be mainly components. I'm going to skip the optional module group, but I just wanted to note that module groups are a nice conceptual way to group together related modules for better maintainability, readability, and structure. But the module group does not affect the existing Helix conventions or architectural structure. And you need to make sure the version of .NET you select here is the same that you chose for the solution. Again, I'll choose the latest version, which is compatible with Sitecore 10. Now, if you open the solution in Visual Studio, go ahead and open the project or solution, and then browse to your project root. And open the solution file. And you should see that your project was added to your solution. I am going to move it up into the feature folder just to make sure that it's appropriately scaffolded. And then if you go back to Windows Explorer, go into the feature folder, you'll see that the page content folder has been created and the scaffolding has been created for you. If you ever want to customize the template that's used for creating projects, you can do that by going to the templates folder in your C drive and then users, and then your username. Here it's going to be Shell. And then app data, roaming, NPM, node modules, generator Helix, generators, add, and then templates. Just note that if you do modify any file in this folder, it will affect all projects that use the Helix generator on your machine. Similarly, if you wanted to customize the solution template, you would do that in the generators app templates folder. And then if you look at your project in Visual Studio, you'll notice that there are no references to MVC or Sitecore. So this tool is not tied to any specific version of Sitecore. You do need to manually add your references and packages here, or you can create a custom template that would have all of that already added for you. And that's it for Yeoman and the Helix generator. I really like this tool. It has a lot of great features. We actually use this to create our projects at TBG, and it works really well. We do have one more solution that we'll talk about next. Next, we're going to talk about the Sitecore Helix Templates Visual Studio extension. This tool was community built and is currently being maintained by my friend Anders Laub. Just like the Helix generator, this tool also builds out the Helix scaffolding for you, both in the Visual Studio solution and also in the file system. Unlike the Helix generator using Yeoman, this tool is tied to specific versions of Sitecore, and it does add the appropriate packages and references for you. The one issue with that is that this tool needs to be updated frequently. The version that's currently out on the Visual Studio Marketplace is up to Sitecore 9.1. And then I also have a version of this tool that was provided to me by Anders Laub for my Pluralsight course, which we'll talk about next, and that supports Sitecore 9.3. But now that Sitecore 10 is out, Anders and I are working together to update this tool for Sitecore 10. There are templates that are available out of the box that support both Unicorn and TDS for serialization, but I prefer Unicorn. It also leverages MS Build, which is a really nice feature in this tool that allows you to do a simple deploy or publish on build, and it will deploy your code to the publish path that you set in the configs for this tool. You can also very easily customize your templates for this tool as well, just like the Helix generator. This is something that I cover in my Pluralsight courses, which we'll talk about next. And it's built right into Visual Studio so that you don't have to switch over to PowerShell at all. It's all in one place, and it is in Visual Studio, which you already use to create your solutions anyway. If you want to learn more about Sitecore Helix, as I mentioned before, I am working on an unofficial Sitecore curriculum on Pluralsight. I do currently have 2 courses available right now. The first course is Getting Started with Sitecore Helix, and it covers configuring a development environment for Sitecore, installing Sitecore, and also setting up a Sitecore MVC Visual Studio project using Helix from scratch, which I mentioned earlier. Learning how to do this from scratch is very important for everyone to understand the tools that help to automate all of the manual repetitive steps. And I also have available now Building a Sitecore Helix website. This one covers setting up a Helix project using the Helix Templates Visual Studio extension. And I worked really closely with Anders Laub on this, and he gave me some really great tips. I also cover creating Sitecore Helix layouts, renderings, data templates, and the most popular field types. And it also covers editing content in the Sitecore Experience Editor and how to support content editing in general. And finally, discussing a Sitecore production environment, including everything from the different server setups to scaling to a high-level overview of serialization and ORMs. Both of these courses are available now, and they both teach Sitecore 9, but stay tuned for my updates to these courses, which will cover Sitecore 10 and Docker. And then stay tuned for my next course, Administering a Sitecore Website, which will include users, roles, domains, and security. And you can go over to my personal blog at hofstech.com/SitecoreSym for more details on all of the topics I talked about in this session. And while you're there, you can also sign up for my newsletter to be notified when I publish new courses. Thank you very much for attending this session. Coming up next, we're going to have a short Q&A.
Hey everybody, welcome to the final breakout of 2020 Symposium Virtual. Thank you so much, Shelley. That was an awesome session. And I'm glad we get to do some questions now. You got to have some extra good news today too, didn't you?
I sure did. I just want to say congratulations to all my friends and colleagues at TBG who won Sitecore Experience Awards this year for both Johns Hopkins and Comores projects. And then we just won the Ultimate Experience Award for the Johns Hopkins project, which is just amazing. And I'm just so proud of the whole team. We worked so hard this year. And if you're interested in seeing the site in action, it's at hopkinsmedicine.org/health. And you can also check out all of our work at TBG at burntgroup.net.
Oh, congratulations. I know you all were working hard on that. So I'm glad you got to get some reward for it.
Exactly.
But yeah, we only have a few minutes with you. And we've got, from what I can tell, a lot of questions over here. So I'm going to be rapid firing a little bit here. And I think one of the things that I think would be most interesting to our audience is do you suggest we take a legacy solution and try to bring it into the Helix world?
Yeah, this is definitely the question I'm asked the most. When you're working with legacy solutions, even if it's like web forms or whatever, the best way to migrate to Helix is in components, like per component. And then I would also suggest that if you don't have time to migrate everything pre-launch, you can always put certain components into a legacy project to later actually add appropriately to the actual feature project and all of that.
Now, related to that, you showed off a couple of tools. Mm-hmm. Are there any specifics we should look at, like when you're migrating that solution into Helix that you should take advantage of for those specific tools?
For the specific tools, yeah, I think your choice of the tools would depend on your preferences and all of that, and then also the project needs. I'd say the requirements for deployment, especially, which is also a question I'm asked a lot. But when you are migrating solutions, I think that the hardest part is splitting up what once was in one project, splitting it up into potentially multiple projects. For example, if you have a solution that requires a connection to a API that's external, that particular portion of the project would go in the foundation layer. And then if it had sort of components that were related to it, but that served up the data returned from the API, then those components would still be created in the feature layer. I like each tool that I talked about. Obviously, I wouldn't have talked about them if I hadn't used both of them extensively. But I don't have like a favorite, it's just what kind of flavor you like. But I will say that with the Helix templates extension, it leverages MS Build as well, which you could also use for your deployments and all that good stuff.
Right. Now, what about Sitecore JSS? So you've got Helix. How do we fit that in? Are you going to do that alongside your MVC solution? Is it going to be separate solutions? Have you seen, what would be a good way to try to approach that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area. I've looked at it a little bit, but from what I've looked at, Helix and JSS can be all in one project, and then that way, all of your components are organized. Because I think that the most important part of Helix is to have a structure in your project that matches a structure in Sitecore, because previously it was really hard to find where the components lived. But if you marry the structure exactly in your project with Sitecore, it makes developers happy.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do, right? Make developers not hate opening up their project and working. Yeah.
Right.
Now, along those lines, I don't know if you have this, but one of the questions was, do you have any like tools or guides that would take this Helix into the CICD pipeline for like Azure DevOps? Like, have you seen anything that people should go take a look at?
Yeah. What we use at TBG is, just the Azure pipelines and releases. I'm certainly not the, overall expert on this topic, but we also use Node for the front end stuff, and then gulp scripts as well, which I think a lot of people are switching over to more current stuff. Of course, you could also do containers and
good plug for
all of
Sitecore
that
10
good stuff. I am starting to study that very much, and there will be more content on that on Pluralsight soon.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people are looking at the different tech that's available. There's so much out there that we can use. One of the questions, and I think you might have touched on this a little bit, but when we were talking about a traditional project trying to come over to the new world, if you've got a project that's not Helix and then you're starting new stuff and you want to do it in the Helix way, are there any ways that you could kind of have them exist together, or is it like you have to do everything all together the same way?
You do not have to be perfect all of the time. We don't live in a perfect world, so I would say that if you have solutions where you need to preserve some of the legacy stuff, I would create a project in the solution called legacy, where I would keep older components that I don't have time yet to completely Helix. I don't know if that's a verb. Maybe I can make it one.
Helixify?
Helixify, yeah. Exactly.
Oh, no, that's great. And I mean, we're down here to the last minute here. So I don't know that we can get into all the questions that we came in here, but what I do want is, how would people come and get a hold of you so they can ask you these questions and get the answers that they need?
Sure. I am all over the place. I'm on Twitter at S Benhoff, LinkedIn, Sitecore Slack, or on Pluralsight. Each course has a discussion area where anybody can ask me any questions.
Awesome. And so we have some other questions here. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to everybody, but have a great rest of the symposium, everyone. And thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.